Hello, everyone. Welcome to this tiny desk lecture for our conflict communication class. This lecture is on nonviolence as a tool for and strategy for dealing with imbalances of power. And that means that I want to look at several aspects of nonverbal communication and go through uh, all sorts of elements of it. I've got my notes here, so I am ready to go. This lecture, I think, is a little difficult. I think the topics are complex. There's a lot of misconceptions about what does nonviolence and communication mean, and I want to look at it as a intrapersonal construct, a interpersonal construct, and of course, a societal construct. Power exists in different ways in our life, and we want to kind of start unraveling some of that through this. And this comes right after we talked about escalation and de-escalation and talking about our emotive experience, which is, I would say this is part two of emotions, managing his emotions and self-regulations. I think one thing about this lecture in particular is that it's personal. I mean, it's always been personal for us in the class, the whole term. We can't talk about conflict without it being personal. But this one is going to go a little bit deeper. Also, because so much of our pop culture experience is wrapped up in witnessing acts of violence. And I really feel like you guys get that just from the children's book story assignment that we did, where you had to do an analysis of the conflicts that were given that are embedded into stories for children as a way to share culture and create explicit norms around what should be implicit norms about how to deal with conflict. So I think that's an important thing to understand for you, that you also have story time when you turn on your TV, when you go to the movies, when you are reading your own books and information, that we are bombarded with stories. And for a story to be engaging, it's got to have some conflict. And often a lot of our stories have violence in it. Now, just like those children's books, we're being told these stories as a way to show a bad way to be in the world, an immoral way. But it doesn't, uh, it still is quite a bit to be exposed to, and it is leaking down into our everyday lives and contributing to myths about conflict and violence. And that's an important piece that we want to look at. Uh, or maybe you will have some insights as I share some of this information with you today. So, when we're exploring the concepts of nonviolence, we want to just define it as the absence of harm. And when we're approaching communication over difficult topics or things that are really emotional and sometimes really salient issues that are that salient meaning important, like these are issues that feel like they need to be addressed in our relationships. They have an immediacy and an impactful, they're impactful to our experience in that relationship. That's how I'm using the word salient. That when we're coming into those dialogue, not, and we're not monologuing, that there is nonviolence in that interaction means that I'm coming into the action with the intent of being compassionate, of being constructive instead of deconstructive. I don't want to polarize. I want to unite, and I want to engage in a compassionate way. And by unite, it doesn't mean that we have to be the same. Often these conflicts especially if they become over really salient issues that like racism or other injustices against groups of people that we might fundamentally disagree. And so when I say unite, it really is that idea of cooperation that is trying to to pull the parties together to find common ground. If you are coming into a conflict as a mediator or a facilitator of conflict, maybe the situation has already had so much harm in it that the parties that you're working with or the stakeholders are coming in with historical injury into that interaction, and it must be addressed in the process to pull to find the place of common ground, to pull to a place of cooperation and dialogue. You cannot avoid addressing historical issues or the history of the conflict as a mediator or a facilitator. And we will get more into that too. We're going to look at Gandhi, John Lewis and Gene Sharp as looking at leaders that are looking at resistance, so as nonviolence as a social resistance tool, as a strategy for change. And that's a different part of the lecture, but we're going to deal with that. And a lot of the Gene Sharp, the civil rights leader, John Lewis and Gandhi, are of course coming out of a strong foundation of religious doctrine over the years, and they are using that to figure out how to do no harm, but create change. Do no harm, but create change. Um, so when we are looking at ourselves coming into an interpersonal encounter, or the way that we speak to ourselves, the intrapersonal conflict, that is really the seed we have to plant to enter into interactions with nonviolent intentions and values. That there has, when I said there's a strategy needs a plan, it needs work, it takes practice, uh, and a lot of thought needs to go into it, whether that's through journaling or people that you feel safe with to dialogue with. And that intrapersonal experience also has to have an aspect of nonviolence to it. And that really means that you want to manifest being in the world in a different way. And you need to think about what you need. And that means that if you are engaging in your plan with fear and anger and and you're allowing, this is it, okay, with fear and anger and these external forces you're allowing external forces to define your identity, and define what you need instead of knowing what you need from your heart. What's happening over time when you are engaged in fear as a driver or anger as a driver is that you are constantly getting a release of cortisol, and cortisol will wear away your ability to have critical thinking. It'll wear away your ability to sleep. It's going to wear away on your health, and your decision-making process becomes much more, uh, it's eroded by by fear and anger. And often part of that power imbalances is to make sure, if power wants to keep power, that they will create a situation for groups of people or empathetic groups of people that makes them feel fear and anger for that group. And through that, it extends that erosion of health and critical thinking skills. And then we see that power can be maintained over long periods of time. So when I say you want to come into a situation to do no harm, part of it is you have to do no harm inside first, and you need to do the work, the mindful work of writing down who you are and what you need and saying it out loud and visualizing the life that you want. This is different than positive thinking because when you go through the act of actually writing, not always this, but actually a physical writing, saying it out loud, doing the breathing exercise and visualizing it, what you're doing in with the neuroscience is you're creating neurons. And if it's a new thought, you're creating new neurons connected and you're creating a pathway. And as soon as you give yourself a brain a pathway and you practice it and you ski down that slope over and over again, you can create more positive change by um, connecting that new neuro pathway. And that changes your perceptual schema. It can really uh, put the attention of your mind into a place of executive action. And that's what we want to do. We want to turn what I'm saying, which is maybe one layer of information. It's definitely not where change exists in what I'm saying. It's really what you do as a physicality to create the neural pathway for it. And not saying that this is just another thing like what we've been talking about before. I feel like nonviolence has a lot of baggage with it that's put on by the society, by the way we tell stories. There's a lot of myths. I wonder if that is because of the power imbalances of our world. I'm just going to put that out there. I'll let you decide that. Uh, so that means that when I'm saying all this, what I'm talking about is what is your own psychological experience of stress. When we talk about once we've taken care of our intrapersonal and we're going into an interpersonal encounter, uh, often our chronic stress experiences are, uh, like we suppress our own needs, and that is the over accommodating piece, not healthy accommodation, but over accommodation can create an unhealthy imbalance of stress. When we're in the constant caregiving role, um, when our sleep is disrupted, when we are uh, having too many too many substances in our life that doesn't let our dopamine levels reset. And when we are experiencing that, and we have neglect, we don't feel seen, we feel like we're always the ones who are having to step up. We are not feeling like we belong, we're excluded. However it's showing up over long periods of time, chronic stress becomes small t trauma, right? That small t trauma of those ongoing stressors can God, it just creates, right? Do you just feel tense me talking about it? I'm kind of feeling tense just talking about it. But it's really important to know that when this is, and I mean long periods of time, like on a job that you've had for years, or being in toxic family dynamics for long periods of time, or the impower balances of children in homes with neglect. And this is different than big T trauma. Big T trauma is definitely an important piece. The one thing with big T trauma, right? So we have big T, little t, and then there's the intensity of high intensity to mild intensity of how that So think of it like one of those big soundboards, right? Big T trauma is an event, an unusual event of violence. Little T trauma is usually that full of long, like taffy, of long, long periods of time of where your cortisol levels and your parasympathetic system never ever come down to a place. Not parasympathetic, sympathetic systems. Did you say it? Did you catch me? Okay. I got the message. Your sympathetic system, when it's never able to get to the parasympathetic, and you don't know how, and you've not had a chance to relax, you don't, and find true rest. These are where anger and violent eruptions often happen. So that means that it's really important to take care of yourself and find ways to deal with how anger is bubbling up in you as a secondary emotion to whatever else is happening. Uh, and these can be the anger, fear, frustration, when it goes unacknowledged, or that when we can't create language around how we are feeling about something, we often will find it coming up as an explosion. And you're like, why do I have anger issues? Why am I so angry? Why did I just all of a sudden explode? I was listening to my favorite song and what one person did something this big. And with the cycle of chronic stress, and then we have that explosion of aggression that sometimes could put ourselves in danger or someone else in danger, because often these explosions, when anger turns into an aggression, and anger and aggression are two different neurocircuits. I don't really understand why, but I know they are two different circuits because I watched the Huberman Lab, and Andrew Huberman was explaining that this aggression circuit can be self-harm, it could be harm to others, it could be destructive to the to something in our environment. And when those things happen, especially if it was just like the last needle in the haystack, or no, that's not the right. It was just that tipping point. It was just a small thing, right? That's the tipping point that we've had all these things piling up, piling up, piling up, and then it's the final straw. That's it. The final straw is the metaphor saying, the cliche saying. And what happens the physical feeling after the eruption is it's like this feeling of true exhaustion. And the exhaustion is it just takes everything out of you, and including the feeling of shame and the feeling of guilt can show up, and the apology, and that wasn't even me feeling like I was embodied by this other bot in being, right? And that's not an excuse for that is someone who has not addressed chronic stress, has not been able to put name to emotion over long, long periods of time. And so we see violence and aggression coming out of that. So that means that part of nonviolence is stress management. And we do have some people in the class reading the burnout book. There's also this woman, Elisa Eppel, who has the stress prescription. And she is got really good exercise on how to deal with stress. And I have that book for a reason too, because the world is busy and it feels like it's sometimes in the upside down place. So when we talk about nonviolent communication and wanting to figure out ways to do that, that is stress management, that you got to put the work in. It means you identifying needs, as I talked about earlier. It's about taking responsibility for your emotions, but not in a cyclical manner of I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to say anything, explosion, apology, exhaustion, and then we're back to suppression, 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 and right, like that kind of cycle is definitely a more violent way to deal with it. So taking responsibility for emotions, um, it fosters self-awareness. You have to do that in dialogue where you understand, where we all are understanding how this is impacting the people around us, especially children. And the experience of a child in a home with someone who is not able to move through their stress cycle in a functional way. And of course, where's my other book on this topic? Um, I don't even have it here. A Good Inside is the book I was talking about, but that's Becky Kennedy, uh, Dr. Becky Kennedy, who, and I've posted her video in the class before, but she's the one, and I like that book because even though she's talking about parenting, it's good for all of us as a way when we are triggered into those explosion moments of how to take responsibility in an ethical way and how to create repair for ourselves and for others. So that's part of what nonviolent communication is. It really is that need to, oh, it was it was almost on top. It was the second book down. I thought it was deeper than that. That's this book, Good Inside by Dr. Becky Kennedy. Okay. Another thing about nonviolence is what do we do with anger, right? So it's important to understand that nonviolence in is needs to be addressed as how to channel anger positively, and not ignore anger. It's what are the things you're doing to decompress those stress cycles? Those of you who are reading the burnout book, uh, maybe you can share your tools in your meetings, but they definitely talk about the importance of the completing the stress cycle all the way through instead of shoving it down, whether it's grief, the anger that's coming from grief, or the anger of injustices, or the anger of mistreatment from work, or the anger of what's happening in family dynamics or romantic relationships. These are really important things to figure out how to not ignore that. And that means being mindful. It's looking for ways to take that the cortisol experience, the amygdala hijack, uh, that when we're in that little T trauma anger place, we're constantly um, living more in our limbic system, and we want to move into the frontal cortex where reasoning exists, and that is through how we sleep at night, and restful sleep. If there's a lot of use of substances like alcohol or over consumption of where our blood sugars are driven upwards, we don't really complete all of the cycles of the sleep. So we get that full bubble bath in our minds. So, really taking note of how sleep exists for you, so that you can get your have as much advantage to move into the cortisol places. So when you can self-regulate and you can be in a non-reactivity place when you notice you're feeling anger. And so anger as a feeling, remember, is different than aggression and violence. And we want to separate those so that we can deal with them in different ways. And then how do you de-escalate, which we talked about a lot last week. So I'm not going to go too much into it, but really focusing on creating self-awareness and creating language around our experiences, and create, whether that, if you don't have, journal it, uh, journal that, call a friend, uh, put your AirPods in and just talk to yourself. And people think you're just on the phone walking around your neighborhood, but maybe you just need to say it out loud to yourself. It seems a lot more normal for people to be walking around talking than it did when I was a kid, a long, long time ago before Bluetooth. Okay. Maybe those people were just dealing with completing their stress cycle, and we just didn't understood what was happening. So we want to talk about also making choices, about living with boundaries and living in a way where we're doing self-care, we're addressing our exhaustion. Exhaustion is a post-anger experience that happens because we're overstressed for too long. And we would definitely want to acknowledge and address those issues. Now, there's a lot of information out there about how you do that. I don't have that in my notes, but there is some information. So if you want me to send you some things about that, that's a really important thing. But definitely finding ways to understand why that little t trauma is, whether it's mild or up here. We are not comparing. We're not going to put trauma on a hierarchy. It's not like big T trauma is different than, it's different than little t trauma, but the impacts on self and things that we need to deal with are important and should not be compared. They're just different. So if we want to really move into interpersonal encounters and live with nonviolence as a part of our daily life, then that is a commitment to self-care. That's a commitment to uh, repairing past shame and past guilt. And we want to find solidarity and connection through our relationships and move into dialogue and listening. So the next part is Marshall Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication. Now, that's what Marshall Rosenberg did, is to really try and find the communication like the script that you need to have an encounter be uh, to enter into those difficult conversations, which we have been kind of doing through the way that I teach this class, but I wanted to be a little more explicit with it this time. Now, this only works if you know how to see and be mindful about the experience that I just talked about. So this is just a link in the chain. It's probably why if you have ever if you're dealing with little t trauma, and you've tried some tactics to deal with difficult conversations or feedback and they felt like they didn't work, or they felt like monolithic, like someone's just asked you to climb Mount Everest, you need to do the work. The work has to come as part of this. So the first thing would be, how are you observational about the conflict, right? And we've talked a lot about this. That's that idea of naming the behavior, not the person. It's saying, not using you and blame, but saying, I noticed that this happened, or I noticed that you, and then naming the behavior instead of moving into an attribution attack. When we have to do that, because we definitely do have places of work where we need to do performance improvements, plans, or we have to critique, that we want to make sure we're doing it in that observational language. And that's one of Mark Rosenberg's suggestions. Again, in I statements, also naming the impact of the behavior on your emotional experience. So when X happened, it felt, I feel, I experienced, this happened to me. That what is the impact of that? And then can you articulate what needs to be met? Why did this not meet why did this not meet a need? Right? Need, there's that word need that usually uh if you are not sure about what need wasn't met, you don't want to just go into the checklist task, you want to actually get to the heart of it, you should get to the need of that's Maslow's hierarchy of needs that can connect to that. So uh, we need you to improve this because the impact of it is that it's making the workplace psychologically unsafe for others or whatever it is, so if you can get that need piece in or a value statement in, remember our mission here, remember why we're in love with each other, and remember our vows and our values of family, and whatever it is that you want to come back to that as well. And then you need to make a request. I mean, you need to set the expectation. You need to be clear. When we talked about Thomas Kilmann's instrument model, and we talked about this idea of cooperation means that how is the volume up, or how are we turning the volume up on the way we engage and listen and include other perspectives than our own. But that means that we also need to be able to articulate and create a certain sense of agency for self, or for what we're representing in the encounter. And that a goal, we talked about goals. Interests are connected deeply to the needs that we have. So having a goal is setting the expectation. Now, this approach is specifically in a way um, to address a power imbalance. So these things, whether you are the supervisor in office structure and you want to have compliance from someone on your team, or whether you are the person on the team that is noticing an issue and trying to bring it up. Because often when we have an issue, we go run to the supervisor and go raise the alarm, and the supervisor will sometimes say, have you talked to the person about that? And you're like, wah, wah, wah. That makes me angry. I don't want to do it. Chronic stress, chronic stress. And you're like, oh, darn, I guess. And they say, we are going to need you to talk to that person. Uh, those are difficult conversations. That is sometimes very painful. It's difficult. I'm not going to lie. I have a hard time with that. And then we need to, but when we do it, And if we can do it in a nonviolent strategy, and we take care of the plan of mindfulness and self-care as we enter into it, I can't promise you that's not going to be painful. I can't promise you that that conflict will be resolved. But when you come in with that, there is a quiet strength of leadership that starts to emerge. Right. And that is what's really important. When we say leadership doesn't mean you're the person in charge, authentic leadership can happen anywhere in the power balance. It's when it's coming in with this quiet strength. And quiet strength means you got your shit together. That's what it means. Uh, and you know how to self-regulate, you know how to be mindful, how you know who you are. And that takes work. You got to put the work in. It's not going to happen overnight. And uh, so, hold on a second. I need to pause this. Okay. It's very exciting to share these things with you. I have more to share. And now we're at the point of my lecture where I'm going to talk about nonviolent resistance in action. And this is deeply tied to both personal and social change. So when we talk about leaders like Gandhi and the civil rights leader John Lewis, we are talking about the dynamics and challenges of injustice. So, what do their everyday principles look like when they show up in conversations? That's what we kind of want to look at. I put up some information on the Canvas page where you can get more information about their teachings. But I just want to kind of look at it. I'm just going to look at three ways. And did I say John Lewis? I meant John Lewis to it. Not John Lewis. Gene Sharp. I did mention John Lewis, but I also want to talk about Gene Sharp. So John Lewis has this concept called good trouble. And it's how you take necessary action when you want to instill fairness practices. So this is the courage. This takes courage, right? This takes courage to address an issue directly. And not shying away from the conflict, we have to engage in a way that seeks justice without antagonizing the other person. And we want to engage that. There's often a myth about nonviolence that somehow means you're passive or you are avoiding a conflict. No, nonviolence, remember at the beginning, I addressed it, but let's just remind ourselves that it's about doing no harm and it's engaging with compassion and constructively and being constructive and compassionate. That's a better way to say it, being constructive and compassionate. And that means that you have to engage and it takes courage. And that means that there's a bit of pain and your limbic system might want to uh, hijack you into fear based on the cortisol rush that we feel from the stress experience of doing something that is we don't want to do, right? That we just don't even want to do it. Maybe we're not scared. Maybe it's something else, but it's not on our list today. We know that we have a stress response. And if you have chronic stress, it can feel even more painful to enter into these very little conversations. So John Lewis's Good Trouble that he created as a way to talk about the civil rights movement, if we bring that into our interpersonal encounters, we want to think about getting into good trouble. We want to have the courage to address an issue directly because we value our own experience, and we want to value the experience of the other person. And we don't want to antagonize. Uh, there's the nonviolent piece. We don't need to be aggressive. Um, and we want to we want to be upfront. Okay. So Gandhi's principles of nonviolence, which is like the truth force. That's how we would translate Gandhi's uh, philosophy of nonviolence. And this is the idea of of a, of making a reasoned appeal for humanity. And in humanity, we can, in this appeal for humanity, that the people who have power should remember that the impact of the actions of the people in power on the everyday lives of others, right? So that Gandhi's principle of truth force is to articulate the human experience. So again, we want to, what does that mean for nonviolence? Nonviolence in nonviolent communication in our everyday conversations, our interpersonal experience. And this is, again, this idea of courage coming from being a representative for what it means to be human and what uh, to stand without aggression. And we gain the strength from knowing that we are not running away from danger because of what we are, the truth we are standing in is to stand for respect, dignity, and that every human should have access to. Gene Sharp, our third, nonviolent resistance in action. So Gene Sharp has methods of nonverbal resistance, and I also put that up there. And this is to his tools of nonviolent resistance is to demonstrate the power, how much power people without power have. Um, and he he's really interested in reminding us that power only has power through consent. And without consent, power has no power. And authoritarian regimes or bad bosses that are using coercive methods for compliance can uh, only have power through consent to follow of the followers. But if there is no consent, Gene Sharp says there is no power. So when we apply Gene Sharp's principles of nonviolent actions to our everyday experiences, we want to talk about fairness through justice. And the concept of fairness as justice is saying that when there is something that we need to create a rule or a law or something, or we have to come to an agreement, uh, we should tilt towards the person or the group that has less power or less representation as a way to create justice. Even if it means it's not always fair to the group that has more privilege in the situation or more access to whatever it is. Yes, there will be an element of not being fair to that, but when we are fair to the unrepresented or the underrepresented party or group, then we are tilting towards true justice. And this would look like small, peaceful, positive actions that grow trust over long periods of time. And that's how we would take that into account. You need to be explicit about it, because we've talked about being explicit about when we create an accommodation to make sure that that is being received that way. If we've decided that's what's right for someone else, but it's not right for them, you are not in true dialogue about what is a fair practice. Okay. What else do I want to say? So let me just talk about going into a difficult conversation. And then there's one more part I want to go over, and that is the power of nonviolence and why it is the most powerful choice to do. And we want to talk about that in comparison to violence. So first, I want to give you just a little conversation tool to use when we need to de-escalate an interpersonal conflict situation. There needs to be a pause. We've talked about taking a break. There needs to be some type of pause. It could be as simple as just saying, just give me a second. Can we just I just need a moment to take a deep breath, whatever it is. It can be really small, but it is a de-escalation tactic. The physicality of that moment should to be leaned back. It should be this idea of looking up thoughtfully, carefully to take care of that parasympathetic system, to making sure that we are not activating our cortisol or adrenaline, which if we are dealing with chronic stress or lowercase t trauma, that we don't want to be activated into that, because that might create a moment of explosion that we don't have control over. So we definitely want to change our physicality. As we enter into the conversation, there's an aspect of accountability, right? There needs to be some aspect of accountability. I don't even care. It can be the smallest thing, even when you are entering into a conversation where you feel like there has been a grave injury. There can be a piece of accountability with that. And it's not victim blaming. It's not being a victim. It's just recognizing that situations are complicated and how you want to be in the world. It can be as simple as, I wish we had a chance to talk about this sooner, right? That is a statement of accountability. Uh, it could be a statement of, I want to apologize for not taking more time to understand this situation better, right? These are very small. It doesn't, and an accountability statement should be just like a sentence, and it should be a short one. It should be a phrase, right? And that's because of that brevity that you come into a conversation and with clear and concise statements instead of a rambling, because rambling can activate that cortisol and adrenaline, and it can move us into summarizing and defensiveness and then attack. And then we're out of our uh, the nonviolence intent that we are trying to go to. So keep it small. We want to be we want to be in dialogue. That means we want to understand. We want to be in a place where we're asking open-ended questions. We can clarify why we want to ask a question, but we really want to get the mic into the other hands and demonstrate our genuine curiosity and interest in the other perspective. And this can often take people into places where it reduces defensiveness It can reduce stonewalling. So there's things like that. And then if we go back to how one of the other part of this lecture, we want to be in those I statements. So when we are de-escalating an interpersonal conflict for a nonviolent tool, as nonviolence in a tool, it's practical to navigate these conflicts with values of integrity, empathy, and creating resilience. And resilience is that quiet strength of self-care and mindfulness work that you've been doing. And that's really where resilience lives. We want, again, I know I've said this already, but I just feel like it's really important to understand that nonviolence is not a passive experience. It's creating consciousness, it's being active, it's being a compassionate approach. It's talk about bridging divides, and we're doing those even when we don't have the power, and that is what leadership is. Why does that work? I do strongly, there's a lot of evidence, historical evidence, that this type of thing works. This type of thing, that nonviolent interpersonal communication and nonviolence resistance as protest works. One of the things is the core idea of why this works is that idea that Gene Sharp talked about, that power needs is dependent on compliance, obedience. Power needs you to cooperate with them. When we look at the history of unions and striking against businesses, that only works, not only, but often the way that works is with that element of strike and boycott. So it's not just that the workers worked out, but the community and the group of people that use that business or are dependent on that business are willing to participate in not cooperating or creating of that boycott experience, just as an example. This can also be about the way that we withdraw loyalty. It can be about the withdrawal of accessibility and not be often power, that authoritarian power wants violence. And this is a really important part of why nonviolence works, because isn't that weird? Authoritarian groups want violence. They want violent resistance. They want eruptions of violence, because when those happen, then there can be violence in reaction, and we move into police state, and especially if there is elements of chaos or elements of feeling unsafe from that surrounding community, they will be, your violence made us feel unsafe, and it will turn against the group. Where when we're using nonviolent actions, you kind of get the moral high ground, is one way to explain it. You get more legitimacy. You draw attention to the power imbalance. You draw attention to the coercive methods of the person in power. And once you start winning over the hearts and minds of even those in witness to it, it becomes more difficult for authoritarian power structures to maintain their um, maintain their position. And this is often why authoritarian regimes want to pull people out of the community. They want to take resistance out. They want to create ways to put them into camps or prisons or other situations. So where they are out of, they don't have a voice, they don't have, and the community can't see them, and then acts of violence by the authorities are less seen, and then they're trying to maintain the moral high ground by hiding acts of violence. It makes me feel sad. I'm taking a pause because it makes me feel sad. Um, Also, another reason why nonviolence is really important is because it you can do it over longer periods of time, because true nonviolence is a place where you are activating your parasympathetic system. You are a place of living a mindful life. You have created self-care, tools for self-care. You're completing those stress cycles. And so you can maintain resistance or nonviolence, and you're not getting exhausted from it. Violence and aggression are always exhausting because of the way that it activates cortisol. It makes it harder to sleep at night. You become more dependent on external things to feel okay, like substances or uh, tangible items. So that's an exhausting life to live in, and it's hard to maintain that over long periods of time, where the nonviolent life is very sustainable. So that is all I think I have to say about that. Boy, that is a lot. So I think I could have done this lecture a little bit better. It's a really difficult lecture for me to go through because my mind is racing with all the things I want to tell you about it. But I hope that you could get through this and get something out of it. All right. You're doing great. I'll talk to you all later. Bye bye.